my innocence. I slept in this nursery. I stared out this window at the orchard. I woke up happy every morning. It looked exactly the same then. Nothing's changed. All white. Oh, my orchard. After the dark and dank autumn and cold, cold winter.
Yes, a cold, cold winter. Have you had enough of that yet? But we're here not to talk about the weather. We're here to talk about the winter or the weather. We're here to talk about genre. Though genre is like the weather. You always have it, right? It's not like you never have weather. You always have, or you ever not have weather. You always have some kind of weather. Even when there seems to be no weather, we say it's just calm. It's like that with genre as well. There's always a genre operating, right? To structure our expectations as we go about reading a text. We walk up to a poem, we say, that's a poem. And all of a sudden we're reading it in a certain way that we wouldn't read it if we said, that's a novel, right? And this is something that Fowler gets into in his difficult and abstract essay that I wanted you to have a stab at, take a stab at anyway. Fowler calls our attention to modern concepts of meaning, such as Dan Sperber and Deidre Wilson's theory of relevance. As Sperber and Wilson have made very clear, Fowler writes, coding and decoding, and that must include generic codes, play only a limited part in communication and interpretation, which are largely a matter of small-scale inferences guided by relevance. The principle of relevance, which is a rather abstract concept that he introduces, operates at every stage. In the case of literary interpretation, relevance must necessarily be to readers' own cognitive environments, even to their own interests. But, and this is an important but whether they know it or not, they're also continually guided by relevance to what they assume to be the writer's intention. Now, those writer's intentions include genre. Like, what is the writer intending to create here? Is it a poem? Is it a play, a drama? Is it an epic? Is it a narrative? Is it a novel? Is it a short story? And so on. He says parenthetically, these promise, after all, the pleasure of recognizing intended harmonies. And you do get this sense of satisfaction. I suppose it's a form of pleasure that you get when you look at a poem and you recognize perhaps the rhyme scheme, and you realize this is a poem. It's a poem that has a rhyme scheme, one of these recognizable rhyme schemes, like a sonnet. We're going to be talking about sonnets. Generic organization, Fowler continues, may be conjectured to facilitate interpretative inferences at almost every level of structure. And we're going to see some examples of, at a very small level of structure, the individual tiny little micro episode, we see genre operating in such a way as to provide some guidance for us, right? As we go about attempting to apprehend or comprehend the play. The point here is that, to try to pierce through the abstraction a bit, the point here for Fowler's making, and not just Fowler, is that we read a work, as we read a work, our individual interests tend to take a backseat at some point to the interest, so to speak, of the genre of that work, the genre that we decide was intended by the author. Our own individual interests matter little often when we try to make sense of the elements of the work. Genre matters more. The genre that we decide that the writer intends. If we think we're reading a poem, we see an image of a small pig in the poem, okay? We're going to think of other small pigs, or maybe large pigs large and small, that we've encountered in other poetic works, right? We're also going to think about the suitability of pigs to, shall we say, the sonnet form and the sonnet content. Do pigs tend to be celebrated in sonnets? I think the answer to that typically would be no, right? What we're not going to do is allow our own personal interest in pigs to, this is as we get better as readers, we're not going to allow our personal feelings about pigs, personal attitudes and knowledge of pigs, attitudes towards and knowledge of pigs, to distract us from what we see as the generic game going on, right? And that's why I say, and it's a continuation, of course, of what Fowler is saying and Sperber and Wilson are saying, so much depends upon genre, does it not? Indeed, as Anise S. Barwashi and Mary Jo Reef argue, and this is taken from the actual discussion question that, frankly, I wish more people had gone after. I think a lot of people stuck with trifles this week, which is fine. That was obviously allowed. Barwashi and Reef argue, Genres structure our perceptions of literary actions, representations, and identifications, and they do so, quote, at almost every level of structure. And here again, there's this insistence that even on a very micro level, you feel the force of genre. Okay, we're gonna see this play out here in a moment. If you walk up to a play with the idea of a comedy or farce in mind, you'll see comedic elements, even if you don't see comedy writ large, right? Which would be a good test case for this claim. And here we're going to get into something that you guys are saying. Brenton is saying. Brenton is arguing, quote, the subtitle of The Cherry Orchard is A Comedy in 4 Acts. So, to Bawarshi and Reeves' point, Brenton continues, this sets the stage. This generic designation sets the stage for how we should perceive actions throughout the play. I thought that was very well said. Certain actions will be seen as comedic. They could have been seen as farcical, perhaps. Of course, farce is a subgenre, have another go with that word, of comedy. Tragedy is a competing genre, right? Certain actions will be seen as comedic. They could have been seen perhaps as farcical, perhaps even as tragic. And we're going to see here in this example chosen by Brenton, this sort of choice between the tragic significance of a small event and a more farcical or comedic one. Here's Brenton speaking about Epikhodov, who has the following lines and directions in the final act. Quote, the aged fierce, in my conclusive opinion, isn't worth mending. This is Epikhodov. His forefathers had better have him. I only envy him. Puts a trunk, here's the stage direction, puts a trunk on the hat box and squashes it. This seems to exemplify, Brenton argues, both the glossary of terms, definition of farce as, quote, broad verbal humor and physical bustle and horseplay, and the Norton's definition of farce as, quote, slapstick or other physical humor. But, Brenton continues, read without the context of comedy, specifically farce, and without the stage direction, in other words, if you don't feel the force of comedy as a genre, you don't feel that you're reading a genre, and you're not sort of obedient, as it were, to this generic designation, this generic kind of compulsion almost, which is, as Brenton has already said, was instituted by the subtitle of the play. This line could be seen, right, as serious and malevolent, since it deals with whether the older fierce is worth helping. Go back to it, the aged fierce, in my conclusive opinion, says Epikhodov, isn't worth mending. So it'd just be left on the stage at the end of the play, and nobody will care, right? The line is juxtaposed with the practical gag, though, of the hat box being squashed, which softens the delivery, right? So it can be seen as a very serious kind of statement that it would be proper to a tragic assessment of someone's fall, so to speak. You could say that fierce falls at the end of the play. But then you have to think about that hat box, which makes us feel that, no, we're really reading a comedy. Brenton continues, perhaps this draws a connection between Epikhodov's reckless speech regarding a human being and his reckless actions towards the luggage, which I thought was a nice afterthought that he had. Another example, let's get into another example of this same sort of moment, right, in which it's a tiny moment. That's what I think makes it especially interesting, right? It's a very small little micro moment in which genre, okay, seems to be exerting its force, right, one way or the other, and compelling us to read the play one way or the other in this moment. Or maybe if we are not sure which genre the play is obedient to, which we are in such moments, right, looking for direction, okay? In either case, genre seems to be the most important element, as opposed to some kind of errant thought we might have about what's going on. Even thinking about the theme itself, the question of whether human beings, for example, are ever not worth mending. Is that Chekhov's theme, right? This sort of hopelessness about human nature, right? Something along those lines maybe is interrupted as we try to solve the more basic and fundamental problem of genre. So here's that other example. And this is one in which violence is done to the human body rather than a hat box. How different may various wielding of Fierce's slapstick in Act 3 and her own parasol at the end of Act 4 appear if we were told that we were reading a peculiarly Russian sort of tragedy, as opposed to what we are told we're reading, a comedy in 4 acts. The Russian tragedy, one in which no character dies, that would be the peculiarity of it, because in tragedy, typically somebody dies. Often, as you know, if you've read Shakespeare tragedy, many people die. Maybe Fierce does die at the end of the play, but you can imagine that you might feel that you're reading oh, this is how the Russians do tragedy. It's not so much that people die, houses die. A house does something more than, but including a family. So it's like a family dies, maybe. A house dies. A kind of whole lineage passes. As Varia exclaims, quote, "Yes, life in this house is over. There will be no more of it." I mean, how are we to take that line? Is that like a tremendously tragic line? Or is that a line in which, well, it's just more silliness, Varia being silly? That is a question, unto itself. But getting back to the violence that we see done in this particular scene, we might still find Varia's violence ridiculous, right? When she hits Lopakhin with the stick, or when she brandishes the parasol and he flinches at the very end of the play. But the emphasis, if we feel we're reading a tragedy, even a peculiarly Russian tragedy, might fall on how the stick hurts. Because hurt it does, right? Lopakhin reports an immense bump coming up, unless that's just nonsense and extravagance and exaggeration on the part of Lopakhin, right? Once again, that's the comedic genre exerting itself when I ask that question. You see what I'm saying? We have to recall this is a man who, as a peasant child, was referred to as ignorant, beaten Yermolai. He received emotional bumps much worse than any physical bumps that he might have received, because the emotional bump is so lasting that he flinches. He flinches when any stick is raised, okay, in his vicinity. And I don't know, I kind of, to the extent that that's what you take away from these micro scenes in which pretty insignificant violence is done to the body of Lopakhin, are you not allowing the genre of tragedy to compel your attention in those moments? So much depends upon genre. So much depends upon genre, right? So much that, in fact, we may imagine that genres are fixed categories, static categories that don't change, and that the original genre is somehow given to us as though we didn't discover them or construct them ourselves as human beings over the course of whatever civilization, in the history of whatever civilization of which we were a part, that there's these fixed categories that probably transcend civilizations. So you have Chinese tragedies, right? Indian tragedies, you have African tragedies, you have American tragedies, Russian tragedies, right? And tragedy is just this category that just won't change. Well, not precisely, right? Not precisely, although the question is very complex. And we're not going to get to the bottom of some of these questions that I'm introducing. The important point is to introduce the questions and get you thinking about some of these topics right now, because I think it's going to make you better English majors, right? So turning to what you had to say, as Chris and Carly agree, The Cherry Orchard, whatever it is, certainly is not simply a comedy. As Chris notes, echoing Joanna's term, some of the social topics are a little too dark, especially the scene where suicide is brought up between Yepakhadov and Dunyasha. Michael asserts that, quote, "This play has elements of both comedy and tragedy. A reader may perceive The Cherry Orchard as a tragic play with comedic undertones, or as a comedic play with dark undertones." I thought that was very well said. Carly introduces the notion of a tragic comedy, or later, as she puts it, comic tragedy, which is discussed, tragic comedy, yes, by Abrams and Harpham, and makes me want to ask you, and this could almost be a discussion question, couldn't it? It's not, but it could be. Does it fit their definition? Does The Cherry Orchard fit the definition offered by Abrams and Harpham of the tragic comedy? Okay. Does it threaten tragedy but end up, this is one of the criteria, does it threaten to become a tragedy, but end up ending happily, as the way a comedy would? So that's where we get the tragic comedy, where even tragedy precedes, in the term itself, the structure of the term comedy, tragic comedy. So you get a sense of the sequence and the way that it works, although you can imagine it working the other way around, which we want to go back to Carly's notion of the comma tragedy, right? Hey, by the way, is not tragic comedy not so much a threat to the notion of genre, it's just a new genre. one which introduced further testifies to the power of genre to structure perceptions, etc. Right? So here's somewhere in the middle. Do you see where we are here? Somewhere in the middle between a hymn of praise of the extraordinary formative power of these fixed and static categories as though they were handed to us by some divinity, tragedy, comedy, I guess tragicomedy, but that's my whole point here is that tragicomedy seems to have arrived on the scene after tragedy and comedy have come into the round. It's a more modern mode, okay? There probably are some tragic comedies. You can make the argument that they're tragic comedies further back in the tradition, but it's not a dominant genre, okay, on par with comedy and tragedy back in the Greek scene, right? The ancients, amongst the ancients, they wrote tragedies and the comedies. They didn't have a category called tragicomedy. When they had their contests, they used to have these contests between these playwrights. They had a contest in tragedy. They did not have a contest in which people entered examples of tragicomedy. That is a more Johnny-come-lately genre, okay? So you can see what it testifies to, does it not? I mean, what I just said, you could say the emergence of tragicomedy as a genre in its own right speaks to the power of genre, right? Because when we get something that falls between two genres, we just come up with a new genre. At the same time, it speaks, does it not, to so it speaks to the staying power of specific genres, right? And the shall we say the power of that very term and concept genre, right? At the same time, it speaks, does it not, to the fact, as I said before, that they really can be mixed, as it were, okay? Although what comes out of the mix between fixed categories that turn out not to be fixed might itself be a genre, if you see what I'm saying. So you kind of get evidence of both possibilities there. The fact that it's not as though genres don't conceivably evolve, that they don't mutate, and that they don't mix, and kind of have offspring, as it were. Beautiful children, the beautiful child called tragicomedy, right? It's a child of tragedy and comedy. At the same time, tragicomedy comes into her own right as a powerful new genre that resists change and that seems to last over many, many years, okay? If it's a viable, as it were, aesthetic offspring. Still, don't some works fall outside of existing genres? Hey, what about trifles? What the heck is it if not a tragedy? And it's not a tragedy, correct? Or wait a minute, isn't it a tragedy? A lot of you replied to this particular item, 200 MOD1 Q1. You walk up to a sad play with tragedy in mind, I think you're going to find tragic elements. And how, if our discussion is any indication, a fact which testifies not to the weaknesses of anyone's mind, but to the formative power of genre, of kind, type, profile, and of raw expectation, of course. That's our major point here. Certainly I invited you to walk up to trifles with tragedy in mind. Little wonder that you did, as John N. argues, drawing on Fowler, quote, trifles can work as either a tragedy or a mystery, depending on how you look at it. Julia finds, quote, death in trifles to be strongly qualifying. I think what John would argue is that many did look at it as a tragedy as opposed to as a mystery. Julia finds death in trifles to be strongly qualifying, strongly itself meriting or a basis for the claim that the play merits this noble label of tragedy. Tragedy often seen as like the most noble, the possible exception of epic, of the various genres. John A. agrees that tragedy needs to involve death, right? Which is not the same as saying that every time you have death, you have tragedy. But nevertheless, let's go on. Emily says trifles could be considered a tragedy, both due to Mr. Wright's death and due to the death of the bird. So we have sufficient death in the play to qualify the play for this title. She also mentions apparent sadness within the Wright household. Is that enough to earn the title of tragedy? Mack agrees that the sadness matters, but feels we need a tragic hero if we're to have proper tragedy. One who, quoting Harfam and Abrams, the glossary, and doing so in an exemplary fashion, quote, suffers a change in fortune from happiness to misery because of his mistaken choice of an action, to which he is led by his amatia, his error of judgment. or as it is often, though less literally translated, his tragic flaw. Mrs. Wright, is she a tragic hero? Yes, Max says. She was once happy, a singing woman, and she errs in killing her husband. She judges ill. Audra largely agrees. Quote, I agree that the marriage was the precipice. By the time we find these characters, the misery has already happened. Audra implies, and Mac ends up agreeing, that the true error in judgment might have been the decision to get married to begin with. Either way, Audra claims, quote, Mrs. Wright is a textbook tragic hero, according to the glossary. She most effectively evokes both our pity and terror. And a number of others also found Mrs. W. sufficiently pitiful. Mac, Maria, though qualifying with, although I couldn't seem to quite cheer for her. Joseph, also qualifying. Unable to cheer. The fact is that someone was murdered. But here's a problem. As Gabriel asserts, quote, the author's choice to focus on the aftermath of the conflict and its repercussions defies the traditional characteristics and conventions of a standard tragic play. And Nolan concurs. The play primarily focuses on the events after the tragedy. As a student in a previous section of 200 puts it rather bluntly, quote, the tragedy did not happen in the play. And shouldn't a tragedy have the tragic action occur within the play? Compare with Sophocles' Antigone. It would be as if we never saw Antigone. We don't see much of Mrs. W, do we? And Antigone had already buried her brother before the play had begun. Another problem. Mac quotes the glossary, quoting Aristotle, tragedy requires, quote, the imitation of an action that is serious and also, as having magnitude, complete in itself. Does this action have magnitude? Lindsay, the husband's death, didn't feel tragic, didn't feel like much of a loss. Gabriel does not find this disqualifying. But Lindsay does, or wonders, at least, whether this isn't something that needs to be taken into account. How important is it that a woman kills her husband who has killed her bird? Could it be seen as almost farcical? I can imagine what Monty Python would have made of this play, right, if they decided to spoof it. Audra quotes the glossary definition of tragedy as, quote, the representation of serious actions which eventuate in a disastrous conclusion for the protagonist. Small-town murder is serious because murder is always serious. But some murders bring about political upheaval. For example, Crayon's murder of Antigone, or Claudius's murder of Hamlet Sr. in, of course, the famous Shakespeare play Hamlet. I should mention that Joseph disagrees the political or social magnitude, which is what I'm now talking about, that's required for tragedy. And in a sense, what Joseph is doing in this moment is disagreeing with Aristotle. Quote, I believe the story is a tragedy because of what Mr. Wright did to Mrs. Wright's bird. Montserrat agrees that the magnitude of the thing killed, in this case a bird, according to Joseph or Mr. Wright, right, in addition to the bird, if not instead of the bird, agrees that the magnitude of the thing killed is not what's important. What's important is the motive, which must be of magnitude. Quote, killing or dying for love is a common factor in these two stories and what makes them tragedies. Here's another problem. Also, is the play's action complete in itself? Do we get the disastrous conclusion? Does the play not appear to be but a fragment of a larger story, a larger action that may rise to the level of tragedy, but not this little episode alone? John A., the play has no real resolution. Nolan agrees. We don't actually get to see the aftermath. Is not the action incomplete in itself then? In the end, the dead bird is concealed. Clearly, Mrs. W. may get away with it. Does one not feel inclined in the end to distinguish between small t tragedy, which I think would cover a lot of what we're talking about, and, well, big T tragedy, textbook, traditional, strictly defined tragedy? Perhaps the Norton editors point us towards the former idea of tragedy, small t tragedy, when they discuss that situational irony as a key component of tragedy. Tragedy emanates from the gap between expectations and outcomes, and even between what characters seem to deserve and what they get. Should we agree then? Then we are apt to find many, many, many works of tragedy everywhere we look, are we not? That is a very broad definition of tragedy. But I think it's one that's become more and more common as time has continued. Of course, maybe what they mean, the Norton editors, by the way, is that this is a key component, not the key component. I think the actual phrase is an especially key component is the actual phrase used by the Norton editors. We'll continue to talk about genre in general, tragedy in particular, this coming week when we take up the question of the chorus. Okay, then, so trifles maybe occupies not the space of an existing genre, but seems to point at something, I don't know, perhaps clearing space for some future genre, conceivably, itself a, metaphorically speaking, genetic mutation away from tragedy, which you see even in some of the decisions made by Glaspell, for example, chiefly that of moving tragic action off stage and placing us at a point outside of such action, beyond such action, where much of the significance of that action is still to be determined, right? It's not immediately present. There are all kinds of ways in which, in fact, we don't have what Aristotle seemed to think was required for a tragedy, and that again could be a nice little discussion question, but that's a good example of the kind of discussion question that would be better if this were a course on Renaissance tragedy, as opposed to a course which is all about an introduction to literature, right? So once again, there's certain topics that are just exceedingly interesting, probably to you as well as they are to me, that are not our proper focus because they just require that we go into too much detail in certain directions. It takes us away from the center line of what we're doing in the class, which has to do in this moment with genre, right? So let's offer something of a generalization at this point. Genres are in motion. They're not static. They're not static. They're stable now. You know, they're not wavering all over the place, are they? We don't have these genres mutating wildly in any number of different directions over time, right? But I repeat, they're not static. They are mutable, okay? And I want to introduce a new concept here because it's an idea that we'll be employing. They're also modal, right? Now, what do we mean by that? We're going to get into Fowler here in a moment, not just to explain what one might mean by modal, but to confirm some of the points that we've just made. So let's just begin with Fowler, and I'll come back to this notion of mode here in a moment, which is something that we'll be employing down the road of the course. This is what Fowler has to say. Considering genres as families, by the way, Fowler's writing about himself. Can you imagine that? In this book, so when Fowler shows up, he's talking about himself. Considering genres as families, as Fowler did, Fowler notes, made it possible, even obligatory, to adopt a diachronic historical approach, and so offered a fresh approach to the problem of historical change. For Fowler, the so-called fixed historical kinds are not at all fixed but mutable, continually renewed repertoires of characteristic features, external structure, rhetoric, topics, and the like, right? And I underline that statement because it struck me as important. For Fowler, and perhaps for us, the so-called fixed historical kinds, comedy, tragedy, perhaps tragic comedy, right? And we can get outside of genre thus considered, and talk about lyric, narrative, which is a kind of a different register of genre that we don't need to go into the differences right now, right? But narrative, lyric, and dramatic. And within dramatic, of course, we have comedy and tragedy, right? But for Fowler, the so-called fixed historical kinds, comedy, tragedy, narrative, lyric, all the rest, are not at all fixed. They're immutable. They are continually renewed repertoires of characteristic features, external structure, rhetoric, topics, and the like. For example, rhetoric in Antigone, you have the chorus speaking in a certain way that you don't have Creon speaking, right? And you have Antigone lamenting. You have like the lamentation over the death of the brother, which is a characteristic rhetorical trope that we find in Greek tragedy. External structure has to do with, we could go through some of the details there, but I think maybe you'd be good at naming them yourselves, right? External structure would have to do with the fact that we have a political situation, you know, Creon, you have those in a lot of the Greek tragedies have, it's an affair of state that is at issue, right, in the story, the external structure, the social structure. It's a big cultural or social episode that is at the center of these
right? And that might even be fall more under the issue of topic. External structure might have to do with, like, even the sequence of, you remember Freytag's pyramid, where we have an exposition, then we have rising action, and we have a climax, which, denouement and all that stuff, right? Falling action and the denouement. What we have in tragedy, of course, is, for example, according to Aristotle, the recognition, anagnoresis, right? It's the Greek term. We also have the scene of suffering, right? So we have all these conventions, aumatia, right? And hubris, the tragic flaw, and the tragic pride, which is at the heart of so many tragedies, right? These are those characteristic features that are continually renewed, and the repertoire is a continually renewed, as tragedy makes its way through the tradition, okay, according to Fowler. And the renewal itself is a sign of mutability, okay, of the fixed historical kind known as the genre, because we do have little changes that you can see, for example, as you just go down the history of, like, Senecan tragedy, revenge tragedy, all the different tragedies, Roman tragedy, you arrive at Shakespearean tragedy, make your way into more modern tragedy, and you see that it's still recognizable as tragedy, but it's not that there has not been no change, okay, in the kind. Now, he goes on to say, such repertoires are not a means of classification so much as a source of signs and a language or coding system that allows economical yet intelligible communication. Quote, change of the repertoires is continual, for new works signify precisely by their modulating of specific previous states of the genre. Hence, their own addition to it modifies the existing state, and a series of such successive changes may alter it almost out of recognition. Yeah, I'm not going to argue with Fowler, except to say that to the extent that it gets altered out of recognition, don't we have a different genre at that point? And maybe that's his point, is that, to the extent that it's not out of recognition, even if it comes close to being out of recognition, you can tell there that you still have tragedy, and it still deserves that term with a big T even, right? Which testifies once again to the power, though not, immutable and static, the power of genre, just as it exhibits this kind of power, what we call staying power, right? It just lasts. And he has more to say, and I've got some other stuff underlined down below, but I think this micro lecture is almost becoming a macro lecture at this point. Let me just read the last sentence. Throughout kinds of literature, the last underlined sentence, throughout kinds of literature, that's Fowler's own book. Throughout, I should say, kinds of literature represents, quote, genre as a continually dynamic metamorphosis, whereby in the course of history, kinds are assembled, become more consciously practiced, form the basis of modes, enter into temporary mixtures, hybrids, and modulations, and combine to form new kinds. And that's where this idea of the mode comes in to play that I mentioned above. Told you I'd tell you something about. May wait till next time to talk more about this, because we're going to be talking about chorus, the chorus for next week. And we're going to be talking about how the chorus moves from a kind of feature of the genre, right, one of those characteristic features, to, it's still there as a feature, when we get to Chekhov, when we get to perhaps even trifles. We see that we don't have some sort of form of the chorus. That'll be one of your questions, something related to that question. If we do not have, do we not have some sort of form, some sort of, successive change, to quote Fowler? Yes, we'll have signs of successive change in the chorus, but we still have something that's not altered completely out of recognition. It still looks a little bit like a chorus, still sounds a little bit like a chorus. Do we not have that as we move forward? Okay, and as tragedy, shows that indeed it's not immutable because it mutates, right? And you wonder whether that's not this thing that he's calling the mode, right? When you have a particular feature of a genre that seems to wander into some space outside of the genre where we don't have a recognizable tragedy anymore, but we have what's called the tragic mode showing up in a play that would seem to be of a different genre or of an indeterminate genre. And this is something we'll be talking a little bit about as we go through and go forward. As you can see, Fowler here thinks that, in fact, new genres sometimes come out of these wandering modes, which are, of course, little pieces, little portions of the repertoire, of the tragic repertoire, right? And little portions of the repertoire, certain elements of the repertoire kind of become mobile and wander out beyond the existing genre into their own space. A drama gets formed around them, so to speak, and before you know it, when enough people find this very compelling, we have a new genre, right? And maybe a couple of different modes wander out of, maybe you could see this even with tragic comedy, that it's like certain portions of tragedy, portions of the repertoire, certain elements of the repertoire of comedy, wander, mix, we get tragic comedy. Okay, well, that's enough for today. Didn't go back to what I promised you last time. Broken promise then? I don't know. I don't know that you're going to lose a lot of sleep over this, but didn't go back to Matthew Arnold. I was intending to do that, but I just felt that no, just get directly to the business of the day, and we can come back to that on some future occasion. I think you did a very nice job on the whole question of the humanities, so it's a topic that I'm pretty happy with right now. So in any event, keep your eyes open for the new granular modular schedule that will be showing up. As you know, those tend to show up on Friday. And get the reading done. It will have the reading listed. And I will talk to you again next week. And of course, you'll have discussion board questions beginning to show up on Friday. So have a good weekend. Bye-bye.